Welcome back, everyday Americans. You've rejoined the Constitution study. As promised, I have with me here Sean Stevens from FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Sean, thank you for taking some time and visiting with us here at the Constitution study.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So, for those of my audience who are not familiar with FIRE, and I know they've gone through a name change since I first started following them, tell us a little bit about yourself, about FIRE, and then we'll talk a little bit more about this National Speech Index.
Yeah, I'm the Chief Research Advisor at FIRE. I've been here about 4.5 years. I started in 2020, right when the world was locked down. So originally supposed to go in the office once a week and then largely work remotely, but now I work fully remotely. I'm up in Jersey City, so I'm not that far away from our offices in Philly, but I'm based up there. I primarily have been in charge of directing FIRE survey research since coming on board. I was previously the research director at Heterodox Academy, and before that, worked in academia. So I have a PhD in social psychology, which I got in 2013, and my research interests beyond kind of the motivations for censorship and things like that we study at FIRE include political psychology, moral psychology, and how those intuitions can distort how people perceive things, how scientists do their work, and yes, can drive people to want to censor other people for their speech.
Well, I still have a saying there are three types of lies, darn lies, and statistics, but they do have their purpose. So I stumbled across FIRE's National Speech Index, the 2024 version. Tell us a little bit about this, because it's been an ongoing thing that I was unaware of, so I have to fix that. And then we'll talk a little bit about what was found in the July report.
Yeah, so the National Speech Index is a project we launched this year in January. It's a quarterly index where we assess American attitudes towards free speech. There's a core set of questions that we ask every time, so we can talk a little bit about those. And then we have left space where we can rotate in questions for current events, or if we want to track longer trends over time, but don't necessarily want to keep repeating the same questions every 3 months. Maybe we repeat questions once every year, something like that. So we launched it in January. It's a partnership with the Polarization Research Lab. That's a joint academic project based out of three institutions, Dartmouth, Stanford, and University of Pennsylvania. We work very closely with a professor at Dartmouth, Professor Sean Westwood. That's the kind of how we work on the National Speech Index. And so every 3 months, FIRE gets 10 questions on the Polarization Research Lab's weekly survey of 1,000 Americans.
Well, it's funny. I started the Constitution study after the results from another that was the First Amendment Foundation. They used to do same type
Yep.
of thing, only they did every year
Mhm.
of State of the First Amendment. And in the 2013 report, I think it was 36% of those surveyed could not name a single freedom protected by the First Amendment.
Yeah.
And that was the genesis of the Constitution study. Why don't we study the Constitution the way my friends and I study the Bible? So I saw this report, and of course, the very first item, the kind of the highlight item, the headline item is 69% of those surveyed said when it comes to their ability to freely express their views, they think we're going in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
So that means, yeah, I mean, again, almost 7 out of 10 say censorship is on the rise, and more importantly, self-censorship.
Mhm. Yeah, so that's a very concerning statistic, and that question is modeled off of kind of a like, how do you feel about the economy, right? Or how do you feel about the direction of the country? That's what it's modeled off of, and so that's a concerning statistic. I would point to another question that we ask. One of the core questions is we ask people how secure they think the right to freedom of speech is, and about 2/5 said not at all or not very. So I think that's in line with this statistic of a lot of people thinking speech is headed in the wrong direction. Probably implies that they think censorship or attempts to censor speech are on the rise. Interestingly, in this run, since we do ask about frequency of self-censorship over time, or no, how frequently they've self-censored in the last month, we actually picked up on a decline in this July set of results compared to our prior results in April. But I would note that this survey was in the field and basically was concluded the day before the assassination attempt on former President Trump, which then almost immediately after that, we saw instances of people getting fired for saying things on Twitter about this attempt. So we will see what happens in October when we look at that question again, because it's, basically, I think we might have just missed something there that maybe it dipped for a little while. And then an incident occurred that basically we might have found at the same level as we did in April. And so maybe it'll tick back up in October. We'll see.
Yeah, it's a fluid thing. I was talking, in fact, I was on the radio yesterday, I believe, talking about how political correctness of my day, right? The 70s and the 80s has really morphed into this woke DEI idea of, if you don't agree with what is politically correct, we will bury you. And we're seeing some of the same things. Again, the other thing again, I'm a Constitution guy. I today, nowadays I spend more time playing inside the Constitution and answering questions. The question was, based on your own thoughts about the First Amendment, can you tell us what you think about the following statement? The First Amendment goes too far in the rights it guarantees.
Mm-hmm.
And it looks like about 53% said something between slightly or completely agree that the First Amendment goes too far. I look at this and say, is it people misunderstand the First Amendment, or that they really believe that they have a right to censor what other people say?
Yeah, so and this question is modeled. It's a variation on a question from that old survey you mentioned from the Freedom Forum. They asked this more in a binary way, like yes or no. Do you think it goes too far? So we gave people more options. So we can't directly compare to those prior results, but we presented the actual text of the First Amendment, so it should be fairly clear what it says to people answering the question. I think this probably does reflect a sentiment that is out there among a lot of Americans these days. Speech has always been, historically, if you kind of look at the history and polling data and in peer-reviewed research, there's always this broad support for the abstract concept of free speech, being able to speak freely. When it's, oh, should the government be able to do this? Or should there be laws preventing people from saying what they want? Or should the press from doing what they want? You get things like 95% of Americans say, no, of course not. Of course not. People should be free to speak and say anything they want. And then, but the other pattern present is once you start giving people specifics as to who it is or what it is they might say, this support now starts to drop. Sometimes it can drop very precipitously. Effectively, I guess I'm making the point of everyone has the urge to censor. It's part of human nature. Everyone's got the urge to censor, and most people give into it at some point, I think. And we're seeing a little bit on college campuses an example of some of this now, where there was for a long time, over the last decade, we've heard a lot about conservative speakers, conservative expression, non-progressive thought being targeted, as you brought up. And now, in the past year, the censors have become the censored in some ways, and they are suddenly reporting more concern about their First Amendment rights, and that they're not as secure on campus. So we have some data forthcoming in September that shows that liberal students are now worried about the security of their speech rights on campus more than conservatives are, because their ox got gored a little bit in the past 6 months. And so this is just examples of how I think everybody has that urge. And it doesn't surprise me at all to find roughly about 50% of Americans do probably feel this way to some extent.
It's kind of like the old saying, a recession is when your neighbor loses their job. A depression is when you lose yours. When it hits close to home, we take it more seriously. And you were talking before about when it hits close to home or a specific topic. One of the questions was, how comfortable, if at all, would you be with the United States limiting the free speech of people rallying in support of Hamas? And 32% said not at all. They don't want any of it all, which means that you had 68% that say they would be at least from not very to very comfortable with the idea of censoring, or at least limiting the free speech rights of people I'm assuming they oppose. Um, does this lead to the idea of, well, it's okay when my guy does it, but not when your guy does it?
Yeah, I think so to a degree. I mean, another way that we looked at that is looking at not at all and not very together, and showing that across the board, the majority of partisans, whether they were Democrat, Independent, or Republican, fell into one of those two categories. So the majority of people, I'd say, seem like at least somewhat reticent. Either they're saying not at all, or they're somewhat reticent to do it, which I think is a little bit encouraging. And I find that even though I presume Republicans out of those three groups are likely to find pro-Hamas speech the most offensive and maybe have the most desire to censor it, I do find that encouraging that a majority of them are still saying, "Yeah, no, I'm not very sure." I think that's there's different ways of looking at that result, but I think that there's a little bit of a positive in there, in that there's some partisan agreement on we actually don't want to limit speech, and a lot of Republicans are in what I would presume putting up with speech they don't like and saying that.
And you're right. That's like I said, it's how you look at the numbers, right?
Yeah.
70% are either not comfortable or not very comfortable. That also means that 30% are
It also means that
somewhat
they're
to very comfortable,
of
which,
course.
so there's good news and bad news.
There's good news
The
and
good
bad
news
news.
is it's still the majority. The bad news is there's still almost a third of the people that are at least somewhat comfortable with censoring speech they don't like.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm very curious is the trend line of this. Are we heading more and more towards a willingness to censor? Because I'm old enough to remember we used to say, I may vehemently disagree with what you have to say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. And I believe that. Here on the radio program, on my website, on my articles, it's not comfortable to have people disagree with me, but I want to hear it because I want them. If you can bring evidence that I'm wrong, I want to hear it. And you're right. That's not human nature. We want to be in our little cocoons and bubbles and have everything cool. So, was there anything from this report that surprised you? That maybe it wasn't in these top line numbers, but you said this was very interesting, probably something worth following up.
Um, so yeah, I mean, I think there's some other things in here that are interesting at even starting with some of the top lines. This was the first time we've asked this two set of questions, but we asked people how often they encounter speech online that's intended to be and fall in terrifying, intimidating, threatening. A lot of these are I would call them buzzwords that people throw around when they want to get something censored. And it's like, do you really feel threatened by that speech, or do you really think that speech is treating you actually violently? Kind of. So we wanted to get a sense of how often people encounter that kind of speech, and then we also asked how much how much people trust the government to make decisions on what kinds of speech would fall into those categories. And so here, it's a mixed bag, I think. There's a good amount of people saying they never or rarely encounter this kind of speech online. But then on the flip side, there's somewhere between 20 and 30, somewhere around 20% roughly, 30% for each kind that are saying they do. This is at 57% for annoying, but I don't think that's surprising. Annoying speech online is probably pretty common. But then what the next question about trust in the government, vast majorities of Americans have little to no trust in the government to actually decide whether speech should fall in these categories. So I think that's very interesting. It goes with a result we've previously found when we asked a question about who should regulate content on social media. Americans have little to no confidence in the government or the social media companies from doing that. And so there's this interesting thing bubbling under the surface here across a couple of surveys that we're noticing that people want content regulated and speech regulated, but it's not really clear who they want to do that.
I'm an old Star Trek fan. I mean, I watched it back in the '60s, and there's one scene where a guy says, "Yeah, I agree. We've got to be in, but I got to be the unity. I got to be the one that's making the decisions." And I see that a lot where, it's this: we don't trust others. We want to be, and we often think that everybody agrees with us, that
Mm-hmm.
the vast majority are just agree with it. And it's really interesting when you find out, not so much. So, And Sean, it's been fun. We got a couple minutes left.
Yeah.
Was there this is going to be a quarterly thing. So you said the next one's coming out in October.
Mhm.
Any other interesting things coming around for Fire or things you'd like my audience to know about?
Yeah, I'd like to announce that we'll be doing in early September, we'll be releasing our the fifth year of our college free speech rankings. So this compares over 250 schools. We surveyed students at all of them, their attitudes and experiences with speech, about speech, and their experiences with it on campus. It also factors in their speech policies, the ratings we give those, as well as outcomes of speech controversies on campus. So whether speakers got disinvited or not, whether students or professors were sanctioned after there was calls to go after them for something they said. Kind of did the administration not stand up for them and then let these sanctions happen, or did they stand up for them and actually defend speech, right? So it's like in the former case, there would be penalties. In the latter case, there could be bonuses to a school's score. But we put all this together and we ranked these schools. So that's coming out in early September. That's going to be accompanied by an additional survey we ran this spring, data from an additional survey that we ran this spring that specifically focuses on the encampment protests that occurred. And for this, we sampled 30 different schools. One of them was Columbia. We picked the other 29 randomly from the pool of schools we ranked this year. 10 of them, as of the date we picked, as of the date we kind of decided to start this project and go forward with it. 10 of them had arrests. 10 of them had encampments, but no arrests. And then 10 of them had neither. As the survey was in the field, some of those shifted around, right? Like encampments started at some places, but we're looking. We have a kind of a more narrow view on some individual campuses that we'll get that there, and then later in the fall, we're going to have data from a faculty survey we ran, where we surveyed faculty at 55 colleges and universities in the U.S., where we asked them kind of very similar questions to the college free speech ranking survey we asked students. So this gives us a chance to compare how faculty think to students, current group of students. But it also allows us to kind of look at faculty from specific schools and see kind of where similar things like what we're doing with the ranking survey for undergraduates, like what schools have more balanced faculty ideologically, where is it more skewed, where did faculty have better attitudes towards speech? Where are they concerned about their administration and how the administration maybe comes down on them potentially? I think this is like a missing component of our free speech rankings, not having the faculty attitudes, since they're arguably there maybe longer than students are. So that's coming down the pike later, but yeah.
That actually it's interesting. I was just thinking we'll have to have you back. Let me know when those come out, because I think that'd be a nice comparison, students
Yeah.
versus faculty, and maybe we'll dedicate even a little more time. Sean, I've run out of time. Thank you. I love the work that Fire does. I love that you keep going back to your roots, because it was originally those are the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education.
Yep.
Now you've gone beyond that. I will put links both to the speech index and to Fire itself on the webpage when this pops up. Again, Sean, thank you for coming here. You are welcome back when you've got some great information. I'd love to talk to you some more.
Okay, thank you for having me. Have a good day.